Well, and thank you for inviting me to talk today. I'm going to build on, I hope, what you've heard in the earlier session about preprints, journals, and how we can begin to balance the needs for speed and quality in research dissemination. And to tell you about my prejudices and my conflicts of interest as I come in. The main ones are that I am employed by the BMJ as an editor, but I'm also a founder of the medRxiv preprint server, and I'll talk about both of those today. So I want to talk a little bit about how the pandemic has changed things at both a journal and a preprint server, but I think also helped for me crystallize what a journal and a preprint server are for, and perhaps open that discussion of how we balance speed and quality. So how did we get here? Academic publishing has been going on for quite a while. And in theory, in an ideal world, if you're a researcher, you do some research, then you prepare it for public sharing. You share it with the world, often in written form. You read and use other people's work that they have shared. You might discuss their ideas, and all of that will lead to doing some more research. And that is pretty much how it worked for about 150 years. I have an image here of Michael Faraday giving his spoken presentation about his work, or in the 1950s, Crick and Watson presenting a written and hand-drawn description of, well, some of their work and some of someone else's that they stole, but that's the way research dissemination worked. But now, in the last 20, 30 years, the cycle of dissemination has become much more bloated, because when you write a description and submit it to a journal, it might be rejected, you might try elsewhere, or revisions might be invited to do more work, resubmit, and eventually achieve publication. And the reason people try that so hard is because they are judged by their publications. It helps to get grants, to get promotions, and to get status if you're published in what some would call the best journals. And all of that bloats the cycle before you can read and use other people's work and discuss ideas. And there are a number of problems with this cycle, one of which I think we'll focus on today. The first problem, as I said, is that you're judged by where you publish rather than how good your work is. And that leads to perverse incentives like continuously trying to be in the best journal you can. That delays publication because people will repeat cycles of submission and rejection. It's also very expensive and difficult to access all the published work that you need to read. And of course, all of these add up to two things: a bias towards publishing positive results, which is not helpful, and also the system is slow. And there are various people trying to come up with solutions to these problems. For example, the open access movement to help with the difficulty in reading and using other people's work. The Declaration on Research Assessment that asks institutions to judge people by the work done, not by where it is published. And operations like Review Commons, which try to have portable peer review that you can take with you to any journal, rather than endlessly cycling new peer review and new journals. But today I wanted to focus on preprints, which really aim to cut off that whole part of the bloated cycle and reconnect from writing a description to reading and using other people's work, and to make it as fast as possible. So I'll talk a little bit about how we came to set up medRxiv. I think it's easy to make the case for preprints, that they speed up the dissemination within the research community. They allow authors to timestamp when they made their work available. Preprints are usually freely available, not always fully open for reuse. But when it comes to clinical medicine, the concern is always that we might surface information or conclusions that are wrong and that harm individuals or public health. So when we established medRxiv, it was done as a partnership between 3 organizations: Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, which runs bioRxiv, a basic life sciences preprint server that's been very successful over the last nearly 10 years. Yale University, where some clinical colleagues who are very keen to make preprints work in medicine are situated. And BMJ, which has, of course, experience in the peer review and publishing of clinical research. And we each bring different things to the partnership, but this is not unique to BMJ product. This is publisher neutral. Any author who will publish in any journal in future can submit. And it is operated as a not-for-profit, initially simply funded by the 3 founding organizations, primarily Cold Spring Harbor, who own and operate the server, but more recently supported by the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. And we launched in the middle of 2019, which was a quiet time for medical publishing. Our submission requirements are that we only take original research articles, which includes methods and protocols, but not commentaries, opinions, essays, or narrative reviews. And that we ask authors to follow the standards of medical publishing. So they declare their funding and competing interests. They state that they've had ethical oversight of clinical research and register studies where that's appropriate. I will say that we thought these were very basic requirements, but we have ended up turning away about 20% of what is submitted to the server because it doesn't meet these criteria, either not original research or doesn't have ethical oversight, doesn't register clinical trials, and so on. And asking for those things, we also ask authors to undertake various declarations, because as part of our risk mitigation of trying not to post material that would cause harm. Basically, we ask, is this a research article in a relevant clinical field? And if we posted it, might there be a threat to health? And if we're concerned in any way, we simply say we think it's better posted after peer review. I would say that happens rather occasionally compared to the number of things we don't post because they're not research articles or have not been conducted with ethical oversight, for example. There are warnings all over medRxiv and individual articles on it to say that preprints are preliminary reports, should not be reported as fact by journalists and others, shouldn't be taken as clinical guidance. And so what effect has the pandemic had on medRxiv? Well, when I looked a few days ago, we had posted nearly 15,000 COVID-related preprints on medRxiv and about 5,000 on bioRxiv, with just tipping into 20,000 combined articles on the 2 servers. And those COVID-related articles are not quite half of everything we've posted, but they certainly had a big impact. In the period from launch until January 2020, the server was growing. We grew to about 10 submissions a day in January, but that doubled in February, doubled again in March, doubled again in April. We had to scale up very quickly. It has now stabilized. And a lot of those were obviously to do with the pandemic, but a lot not. I mean, 50% or more not to do with the pandemic, and simply people recognizing the value of preprints. The orange parts of the chart show you where authors have revised their preprint after posting, but before it's published in the journal. The usage of medRxiv similarly took off. We have had full text XML since Chan Zuckerberg funding kicked in. But even before that, 10 million or more people downloading per month to read preprints. And the posts by country, I'm afraid Japan is in the category down at the bottom, but we saw pretty much a portrait of the pandemic. Initially, a large number of articles coming from China, then Italy and the UK as they succumbed to the pandemic. Obviously, the US rising fast as well. But we have now had posts from almost every country in the world. And there is widespread recognition of the value of preprints and that they help, especially in the pandemic when we have needed information to be shared rapidly. Both PubMed Central in the US and Europe PubMed Central have taken to posting COVID-related preprints to make them more accessible. But there are also worries about the misuse of preprints and of news stories covering the results of one preprinted study as though it has changed the face of science. But I want to go through an example that I think shows why, despite their misuse, preprints are worthwhile. And this takes us back to the middle of last year in the UK, where the pandemic was peaking. We were in a major lockdown, and the government chief medical advisor issued a press release saying that the National Health Service should start using steroid treatment for patients in hospital requiring oxygen and on ventilators as a result of work done in a national clinical trial. So this was simply a press release on the 16th of June telling doctors what to prescribe. 1 week later, the entire study was posted on medRxiv. And I will say most of that week was taken up with writing the paper, not with screening it for medRxiv. So the press release was issued really before the work was even in the form of a draft manuscript. But once that manuscript was available, all doctors and researchers could see the data on which they were being advised to prescribe a new drug, actually an old drug, but for a new purpose. And that, that took a week. Now, you'll see in the red text that article's since been published in New England Journal of Medicine, and it was published very quickly, just a month later in New England Journal. But in the space of that month, even just in the UK, hundreds of people will have had their lives saved by being treated with a drug that had no peer-reviewed published evidence available. And I would argue it was better that you do so on the strength of a full preprint manuscript than simply a press release. So I want to shift gears a little and talk about the BMJ, a journal, also a print magazine that goes to UK doctors, that publishes a range of things, including research articles, but not restricted to research articles. And it is part of a portfolio of journals published by BMJ, 60 or so journals, ranging from traditional printed articles with subscription-based content, as well as some open access, and other journals that are 100% open access, including our mega journal, BMJ Open, that publishes thousands of articles per year. And when we peer review at BMJ, it is a much more detailed and rigorous process than the couple of days of screening at medRxiv. Editorial teams assess the work in detail. If they send it for review, there are 2 or 3 experts, maybe a statistician, a patient reviewer who gives the patient perspective, and a group of editors will again assess the article in the light of peer review, and they invite revision. And this process will tend to take weeks, and if the authors revise a manuscript, certainly months between submission and publication. And when we publish work, at the moment, we are making all COVID-related information freely available, whatever type it is, but usually our research is open access and other material is available by subscription. We do have experience of publishing work that's previously been a preprint, and this example happens to involve one of my medRxiv colleagues, Harlan Krumholtz, a great advocate of preprints. And he and his team had been working on, they knew that the American Heart Association and the American College of Cardiology were due to revise the blood pressure guidelines that define when a person has hypertension and so should be prescribed drugs. And so they prepared modeling based on different possible recommendations. And essentially on the same day as the American College issued their new guidelines, they were able to post a preprint saying how many more people would be medicated as a result of these new guidelines if they were applied in the US and in China. That preprint was therefore discussed at the same time as the recommendations, but it was also published after peer review 7 months or so later in BMJ. And because it was quite new for us to be publishing work there, in a preprint, we also had a blog post from the author describing why he'd chosen to do that and what his experience was, because of course they got a lot of feedback and input into the work along the way. And amusingly for us, the New England Journal of Medicine, which at the time was against preprints, now does not object, had a podcast on what is this preprint thing and how might it change how we think about journals. So that's sort of the picture. Maybe 3 years ago, journals were still discovering preprints. So let's look a little bit at what are the different things that preprints and journals are for. This list of the functions of scholarly communication, I've highlighted in blue all the ones that journals do, but only a few of those are also highlighted in red for preprints. Claiming precedence and registration, and archiving to preserve the record. There is a little bit of awareness raising around preprints, but mostly that is not done by preprint servers, that's done by authors themselves. The key function of establishing the validity of the results and of selection for what is most interesting to a particular audience is entirely done by journals. And I talked about the cycle of communication, but of course in clinical research, what we want to do when sharing the results with the world is to change clinical practice if research shows that a new treatment is better or a new approach. And so this rather complicated ecosystem of trying to establish trustworthy evidence, to synthesize it with existing evidence and then disseminate that as a recommendation to clinicians and ultimately to patients is a very complicated cycle of its own. And a couple of examples of how the BMJ is doing that. On the left, we have what are called living systematic reviews. in the example of drugs for COVID, that is a changing landscape. And each time a new drug comes up that is recommended, then this systematic review is updated accordingly. The other part of the story there is that we're working with the MAGIC group in Scandinavia, who aim to do what they call rapid recommendations, which is to ensure that there are only 90 days, 3 months, between a result coming out that could change clinical practice and it being thoroughly enough evaluated to make a clear recommendation on whether it should or should not change clinical practice by day 90. And we work with them to ensure that the peer review process and so on is as rapid as possible, so that we can put out clearly thought through, evaluated, rigorous research results as rapidly as possible. So COVID has been the first time that preprints have been published in time to, posted in time to impact an epidemic. Of course, partly that's because the pandemic has gone on so long, but even without that, it was the first time that we were seeing the posting of preprints in really days after the first clusters were reported. And the graph shows a contrast with the cases of Zika virus and Ebola, in which the articles were published really after the initial epidemic had been resolved. And so will that help, all this outpouring of information? Well, we do know something about how our preprints much worse than peer-reviewed articles at telling you what you need to know. This particular study done by independent researchers looked at the standards of reporting against specified sort of checklists and so on. And they found a difference of 5% between preprints and peer-reviewed articles, which is, you know, small but significant, I guess. But there was more difference in subjective ratings of things like how clearly titles and abstracts presented the main findings and how easy it is to work out the key information from a study. An issue that is clearly not helped by preprints is the issue of waste in research, but that is not unique to preprints. The production and reporting of research evidence has been shown to be hugely wasteful, you know, decades ago. And unfortunately, preprints haven't helped us solve that. I'm not sure if they've made it worse. Perhaps that's something we can talk about. But it's also worth pointing out, I know Joris and others mentioned Retraction Watch. It is a website that looks at papers retracted from journals, and there have been, you know, a large number on COVID retracted from journals. So although there have been a small number of problematic preprints posted, it's not clear to me that that's even been as many as there have been published in journals that have subsequently needed to be withdrawn. Certainly both occur, whether or not at the same rate. So I think I will finish there to allow time for discussion. Hopefully I have provoked some comments that will lead to discussion. Thank you.